wind, depth of the sea, stability of earth, firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's eye to look before me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to protect me from all who shall wish me ill. I arise today.
Okay. So our first session this morning will be understanding the many worlds. And you see that the first point is to try to talk a little bit about what do we mean by this phrase, many worlds. Let's try to think about that a little bit together. Our workshop entitled SSND Living in Many Worlds. What do we mean by that phrase, many worlds? We already know one meaning. When Pat Flynn invited us last night to look at each other and the worlds we are from, we were referring to a number of things. We were referring to the cultures we come from. They're varied indeed, aren't they? We're also with the continents we're from. We're also aware of the variety of contexts in which we minister and live that represent different cultural worlds. Multiple cultures and multiple worlds. Some of us work, in fact, in contexts that are dominated by multiple religions as a significant factor of your ministry. But let's think of another meaning of this phrase, many worlds. Let's take it down to our own individual lives. Reflect for a moment about an experience you quite possibly may have had of planning a Jubilee celebration or a religious profession in more recent times, or whatever, family wedding. What do you do at those events? You bring your worlds together. You bring your SSND community together, you bring your family together, you bring your work together, you bring your friends together, and it can be a frightening experience to plan it. But those are your many worlds in which you yourself, even as an individual, live. You live in many worlds. What I'd like to do this morning is to try to move to the heart of this pluralism, of this diversity, of this many, manifold worlds, by understanding worlds in the sense of worldview. That is, by understanding worlds as in the sense of your view of the world, your fundamental view of the way the world works, what it looks like, what reality is. So let us, for our purposes this weekend, understand world as worldview. And what is a worldview? It's a view of the world. It's constituted by a set of fundamental attitudes toward reality, toward value, toward truth. Your worldview is quite literally your view of the world, of reality, of the whole, how it works. That's why I like to say that a worldview answers three sets of questions. And you see those on your worksheet, the three sets of questions that a worldview answers. First set of questions, what does the universe look like? How does it work, and where do we fit into it? We can call that our world picture, as we have on our chart. The second set of questions, what is good and important? What is true, and how do we know that? Not only what is true, what is good, but how do we know it? We can call that truth and value. And the third set of questions, who really runs the universe? Is it guided, and if so, by whom? We can call that design and purpose. Do you see that? The answers to these questions have shifted profoundly in the 2,000-year history of Western Christianity. And that's what we want to spend this morning talking about. How have the answers to those questions shifted quite profoundly in our history? Let's stop for a moment, though, before we go in. What I'm going to do eventually, and we'll get to this, I promise, because we always like to fill in our worksheets. I'm going to get to talking about each of the worldviews in relation to each of these sets of questions. So you sort of end up with a grid of 9 points, the 3 worldviews on the 3 sets of questions. But let's just look at the questions before we begin to try to answer them and see how these different worldviews approach their answers. Think for a moment about the impact that the answers you give to those questions have on how you understand something like the will of God. What is good and true and important and valuable, and how do you know that? What is the will of God, and how do you know it? How you answer that question is going to be very significant in religious life, at least. How do you view, let's all grant the fact that our resources in the congregation are dwindling. Personnel resources, at least, are dwindling. We're aging and so forth. Well, then we have some very serious decisions to make about future direction. What use are we going to make of our dwindling resources, personnel, money, buildings, places, and so forth? How do you answer a question like that? The answer you give is going to be deeply rooted in your sense of truth and value. It's going to be deeply rooted in your sense of, is there a design and a purpose to the world? And how do we know it? What is your deepest conviction about what is valuable, about what God wills for the world? That's going to be what you bring to the conversation. What if we're coming to the conversation out of very different understandings of what is good and valuable? Well, one thing is for sure. Most of our differences, and I believe this very deeply, most of our differences in these community conversations do not come from ill will. Our differences don't come from being intractable or ill-willed. They come from different, profoundly different senses and instincts as to what is good and valuable, as to what's important. Rooted in different senses of the ideal of holiness. What is your ideal of holiness? That's what's going to determine what you bring to the community conversation about our future direction. If we can talk to one another then at that root level of what we think is good and true and valuable, what we think is the ideal of holiness, what is God's will and how we come to know it, if we can talk to one another on that level, the future directions will take care of themselves. The future directions will flow. Because that diversity then is not going to be resolved necessarily, it's not going to go away, but it's going to be rooted in a mutual respect and even affection for one another. Because we will have understood that sister, those sisters are coming from that sense of holiness. Do you see? So you have a sense of what we mean by worldview, a fundamental perspective, your basic stance toward reality. Richard Gula, a moral theologian from California, writes this. He says, when I try to explain worldview and a shift in worldviews, a clip from the Peanuts comic comes to mind. You know Peanuts? Linus is struggling with his introduction to new math. In frustration, Linus exclaims, "How can I do new math problems with an old math mind?" And Gula writes, Linus has it exactly right. The issue is his worldview, his point of view, his fundamental perspective. And something like this old math, new math shift has occurred in theology and in the history of Christianity. And that's what we want to look at this morning. So let's move to our second point, which is to recognize that if you paint with very broad strokes, Western Christianity has existed and continues to exist, continues to be embodied according to three worldviews. So they're running along simultaneously within Western Christianity. And I want to put a parenthesis here and indicate, for the sake of our wonderful diversity, that we will be talking about Western Christianity this morning. We're very interested, though, in hearing the other than Western perspectives. And I wish that we had time to talk about the struggle that we are engaged in now to become a truly world church. What that really means to no longer be Eurocentric, but a truly world church. It's the great struggle, I think, of the church today. But we have to limit ourselves to talking about Western Christianity, which we will do, and perhaps in the discussion we can get into more of other perspectives. Each of these, the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern, gives very different responses to the three sets of questions concerning world picture, truth and value, design and purpose. And you'll see that when we go into examining the answers. First, however, let's just lay out the timeline or the chronology of the three worldviews. And then I'd like to give Mary Irving a chance to comment. So let's lay out the timeline. Our committee's very into technology. We even have a little laser pointer. Isn't that impressive? I've been having fun with this all day. So we'll look first at the that doesn't work. Oh, there it is. We look first at the pre-modern. And I'm going to suggest to you, what I want to say is that the pre-modern extends from antiquity in Christianity up to the beginning of the 17th century, up to the beginning of the 1600s. Now, that's a long time, isn't it? We'll look at that chronology in a moment. I want to identify modernity, the modern worldview, as running essentially, as emerging with clarity in the second half of the 17th century and intensifying through to the end of the 19th century. Okay? And post-modernity, or the postmodern worldview, as really, I want to say, identical almost for the sake of our purposes with the 20th century. Now, before we go any further, let's take a minute to look at that chronology. Okay? Chronologically speaking, every single sister in this room has lived her entire life in the emerging postmodern world, 20th century. Right? However, big however, in terms of our faith life, in terms of what means the most to us, we have in fact lived our lives, especially the last 35 years of our lives, shifting from one worldview to the other, to the next, and back again and all around the place. Because it really was not until the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s when the Church itself asked us to embrace critically, not just to embrace, but to embrace critically the modern world. You see? So we grew up, let's face it, we grew up with a pre-modern, classical grasp of the faith, but not only grasp of the faith up here, a pre-modern, classical, old love's power to move us, way down deep in the heart, where those embers are always able to be fanned, as we said last night, into flame. So think about that. In the last 35 years, you have done what it took the human race 300 years to do. I mean, if you think about that, at the Second Vatican Council, when we were asked to embrace critically the modern world, what was happening? It was already apparent that the modern world itself was collapsing. Postmodernity was already well on its way to being in hand as a worldview. Now, take that in for a minute. It's no wonder we show some signs of having an identity crisis. We have stretched among and between three worldviews. three fundamentally different ways of viewing the world with regard to every aspect of our life: our dress, our daily order, our ministries, our community life. What is more, the shifts that have made the greatest mark on us are not visible the way dress and ministry and community life are. In terms of our imagery for God, our experience of God, our ability to pray no longer unambiguously to God in the old language. No matter what our position on that is, we can no longer be unambiguous about it. That shift is the most profound of all. A shift in your imagery for an experience of God. If religious life is a life lived totally focused on God, in relationship with God, then shifts of that kind, my goodness, are dramatic. You have one piece of homework for today. Find one other sister in the course of this day and say to her, "You are wonderful because you've lived through these last 35 years." And mean it. And she can say it right back to you. It's been extraordinary. Extraordinary in that shift on those fundamental levels. Another thing to note about the chronology, as we're going to see, we are all over the place as individuals and as communities. So you can say, for instance, you can be very excited about postmodern science, the new science of postmodernity. And we can all get very excited about that. And we read about that and we love that. Then, though, somebody relates that for you to providence, to God's design and God's will and traditional understandings of providence, we might have the reaction to say, "Oh, well, hold the phone here. Wait a minute now. I love this new science, but don't mess up my idea of providence." You see? And that's going on in all of us. We are this ambiguity. Karl Rahner says, you know Karl Rahner, the great German theologian this century, he says, "Not everyone who lives at the same time are contemporaries of one another." Isn't that good? But we don't need Karl Rahner to tell us that, do we? All we have to do is go to a community meeting, go to a meeting to plan a Eucharistic celebration, pray together, make decisions about what we're going to do and why, and when and how. You see? This is the situation in which we are moving into the third millennium. No one of us is solidly in the postmodern world. And I would say, given what we have been through in the congregation of the School Sisters of Notre Dame, no one is solidly in the pre-modern world either. We're all over the place. But you know what I think this does? I hope it does, is to give us a language to talk to one another. A language to say, this is where I'm coming from. This is what's deeply rooted in me. And if I'm not where you are, I can't just jump over there, because we're talking about something very, very deep. We're talking about what made Marina Warner cry. The old love's enduring power to move. Let me make one more comment about the chronology, and then I'll turn it over to Mary. That's a very long time from antiquity to the beginning of the 1600s for a worldview to obtain, to prevail. And you may say to yourself, well, my goodness, think about the history of that. You have what's going on. You have the early origins of Christianity, then you have Greek Hellenism, then you have the medieval world, then you have the Renaissance. Are you saying to me they're all lumped together? Well, if you're painting with very broad strokes like a billboard rather than a fine portrait, yes. Because in the terms of the way these fundamental questions would be raised, asked, and answered, yes, they are of one worldview. So Martin Luther in the 16th century, in the 1500s, you can say there are roots of the modern world in Martin Luther's revolution, in his Reformation, because what Martin Luther does is focus on the individual for salvation. That's going to be a very important feature of modernity. But Martin Luther has much more in common with Thomas Aquinas, who lived 300 years before him, than he does with anybody who lived in the 18th or 19th century. He would be able to sit down at a table easily with Thomas Aquinas and have a conversation, much more than he would with someone truly in modernity. You see? It's also the age of discovery, when from Europe the travels to the New World and beyond showed an undeniable pluralism of cultures. That's also true of this time period I'm lumping together. But the pluralism of cultures wasn't acknowledged, it wasn't recognized, you see. Remember, the 16th century, the 1500s, is also the time of Shakespeare, us in the English-speaking world. You cannot understand Shakespeare unless you understand the classical world, how it's pictured. The stage of the Globe Theater itself is a model of the world, the Imperium above, where we live and work and have our activity on the stage, and then under the stage were the figures of the underworld. You know, to appreciate a Shakespearean play, you have to know the classical worldview, his allusions to mythology and so forth. So while I think you can see the roots earlier of modernity, I still want to say that the basic worldview obtained for 1600 years within Christianity, that's a long time for those deeply rooted sense of value to prevail, isn't it? You see? And let me turn over to Mary now, and when I come back, I'll go through the three worldviews and answer the three sets of questions in reference to them.
I'm going to make a few observations on two of the general topics that Mary spoke about, the picture of the world and where humans belong in it, and then some questions of truth and value. It struck me, as Mary and I were preparing this material together, that sometimes it's really easier to see a worldview in another culture or in your own culture a long time ago than it is to see your own worldview. You know, there are people who say the last person you ask about water is a fish. Hard to step out of your environment. So let me give you a couple of examples, first of all, from some other cultures. Some of you may remember that when King Hussein of Jordan died, Queen Noor, his wife, who was actually an American, Lisa Halaby, was not allowed to attend the funeral service. Shocking to us. In that Islamic tradition, accepted, and she accepted it. Some of us may also remember that during the Gulf War, because of the crisis, Saudi women were allowed to drive automobiles. And when the war ended, the restriction returned that no woman may drive an automobile. Shocking. We can see the worldview there. Many of us have learned, primarily through the efforts of feminists in the last really year, about the experience in many African countries of female genital mutilation. It's abhorrent to many of us. It's caused a great deal of conflict. It still isn't settled either in their cultures or in ours what should be done, because some people argue it's their culture, why we shouldn't mess with it and criticize it. And in the countries themselves, many people uphold it and other people don't but are afraid to speak. Now those two examples I use to look at that issue of world picture and where do humans belong, and I focus the examples on how do the humans who are women belong in those cultures. Now let's go to the second category here, the questions of truth and value, of goodness. And I want to use two brief examples from stories about the life of St. Augustine that he gives us in his own Confessions. The early history of religious life in 4th century Christianity was a history of men and women withdrawing completely from the political and social world of their time and living in monasteries, usually out in the country. In Palestine, it was in the desert, but we're talking about European now. So Augustine was aware of a monastery up in northern Italy where he was working as kind of a political functionary for the Roman Empire at that time. And he met somebody who told him a story about two of his colleagues who had gotten fed up with their life in the world and had withdrawn to that monastery. And these friends had gone and they had seen the peace and joy of being away from it all, out in the country, divorced from the complexities and messiness of the political world. And Augustine's heart yearned for that. He was product, like his friends and the friends' friends who had joined the monastery, of a Hellenistic culture which saw the world and all its material necessities. They didn't deny they weren't necessities, but they didn't like them. They saw the world as inferior to the spiritual or the transcendent, as it was sometimes called. There was a definite hierarchy of value in Hellenistic culture, that the spiritual was much more important than the material. Can we see then how that concept of religious life was grounded in and influenced by that Hellenistic culture? Actually, in the earliest centuries of the church, those who became celibate for the sake of Christ lived right in their own homes and wore ordinary clothing and traveled around. So this is a new image now, a new example of the influence of the culture on the religion, the worldview on the religion. That's a pre-modern view of the world, and as Mary said, that view really lasted until the middle of this century. Most people who entered religious life were leaving the world. So it has a tenacious hold on our imaginations. And it's not surprising that it takes a long time to rethink an attitude at the imaginative level to the world. We might be able to do it conceptually, but imaginatively in the ways that really count, it's a very slow conversion, really, to openness to the world, a critical openness to the world. The second example is from a life of St. Augustine before he converted. He had a group of male friends. They loved philosophy and the search for truth. Augustine says, "Truth, truth, I longed for you in the marrow of my bones." And he really did. He was an ardent seeker after truth. So these buddies hatched a plan. We're going to go and we're going to find a country house and we're going to live and spend our days dialoguing and being philosophers and searching about truth. And then Augustine very innocently says, and then we remembered that a couple of us were married and with children and the whole plan fell through. The necessities of women and children, the material, were perceived as a hindrance to the search for the transcendent. A really graphic example. The issue here is Augustine had what Mary will call later on today no historical consciousness of this. He didn't know he was living in a Hellenistic worldview that prized the spiritual over the material. He was so immersed in it, he didn't have a clue. But it certainly influenced his decisions, both before and after his conversion. I'll just leave you, before Mary picks up again, with a couple of questions about just this general concept of worldview that we have talked about, or she has talked about today. If you understand yourself to be Western, and maybe one way to describe Western, and Mary can correct me if this oversteps it, One way to talk about yourself as Western is probably to say you're from a northern country, North America, Northern Europe. You're probably white. And even those of us who are not male have been profoundly influenced by the all-male groups of people who have defined these terms. So if you are Western, how does this understanding of worldview strike you? Does it make sense to you? Just sit with that question. And if you are not Western, if you would not identify yourself as Western, does this notion of worldview have meaning for you in your culture? Mary's going to move now to give us a much more detailed view of the three worldviews that she introduced you to.